Okay, so I didn't really get on board the whole Love Your Railway hype train that was running over the summer. Not because Laurie Rose has covered it pretty comprehensively already, or that I was worried that some sick sad on the internet was going to make an effing Anonga joke out of it, or considering the recent issues at railways like the Bluebell, Severn Valley and West Somerset between their management members and shareholders, it's kind of hard and maybe kind of inappropriate to preach people to love their railway at the moment, but simply because of time, or lack thereof. And time really is what this issue is based around. Now the summer's passed and the results have proven quite strenuous for some places, it's painfully ironic how a scene from an old throwaway film can double as a warning from history, isn't it?
Never shot a rabbit on a Sunday and may I drop down dead.
Trap them. What's the difference? I should report this, Dan. Turn off! Turn off, man!
If I'm going to do this job, I don't let it interfere with my business any more than it do with yours.
This service is going to be efficient whether you like it or not. We cannot afford to have any... Come back! Come back! We need you!
All right. So long as we understand each other, that's all.
Nearly 70 years later, and heritage lines have been making headline news facing a crisis for recruiting new volunteers, even before the Bat Plague. Midland Railway Butterley in Derbyshire were particularly hard hit during the summer of 2019, forcing to cancel for more than 20 running days due to a lack of volunteers to even open the railway up. The issue, coupled with the need to save costs, forced the railway to reduce the number of running days in 2020, until that thing happened and they shut completely for 17 months. Now granted, some places are better off than others in terms of manpower, so they may pass this off as a non-issue. But when everybody is trying to attract new people in, the problems become more strained when exceptional circumstances put the brakes on everything. The lack of heads everywhere hasn't been caused by COVID, but it has been exacerbated by it, particularly during the time when people who came into contact with someone who had the virus had to self-isolate for 10 days. In order to keep out of debt, the Kent and East Sussex had to lay off some of its full-time staff, thus relying on existing volunteer labour more than before. Now smaller heritage railways like the Spa Valley don't have full-time paid staff, but then the Keza is a bigger organisation than the Spa with more assets to maintain. So why is railway preservation becoming more strenuous, apart from the obvious? Part of the problem seems to be that one role at the railway seems to be more attractive than most, the chance to become a train driver. In the days of Casey Jones, it seemed like rock star status in the eyes of all small boys, and no doubt still seems that way to many people. But the trouble is, there's more to running a railway than just shoveling coal, pulling a lever and leaning out the window while the wind rushes through your hair without a care in the world. Roles such as guards, signalmen, booking office staff, travelling ticket inspectors, caterers, locomotive and rolling stock maintenance staff, permanent way gangs, station staff, and even railway management often tend to be overlooked by the travelling public when they're tempted with applying for membership. Not forgetting the smaller roles like gardeners, because those station flower beds won't make themselves look pretty, or caretakers, because someone's got to clean up after one of Richie's Friday night fry-ups. Quite often, the newest recruits get lumbered with mundane jobs because of old-school pecking orders. Of course, jobs like toilet cleaning and weed killing are still essential to maintaining a good public image for the railway, but their lack of attraction are not necessarily what people sign up for. But even if there is a pecking order, there can be shortages of footplate crews. On August the 16th, 2021, the Bluebell Railway was unable to provide enough crews on the roster to provide a full day of steam-hauled services, meaning 2 round trips on the 100% steam-worked railway of the late 20th century had to be hauled by a gronk in a high-vis jacket. Now it is true we've faced hard times for getting young people in for over 30 years, but now seems to be harder than ever before.
Those of us that grew up with steam are into this in a big way. You know, it's a labour of love. It's very difficult now to attract the younger generation, and part of that is because of their culture, and it's easier to play with a phone than it is to come and get dirty. But secondly, they didn't grow up with them. They never saw them in traffic, so there's not the same pull, really, I don't think. Maybe some, maybe there is with the people that reserve diesels. And I think that's going to be an ever-increasing threat.
Another part of the problem seems to be that it's hard for new people to fit into such a unique but often challenging environment. I'm not going to go into the whole discrimination issue, seeing as I've already gone into detail about that in previous editorials, and will likely go into more detail about it another time, But the long and short of that problem is that some people end up applying for one role only to find they're just not medically suitable for such a role and are either directed towards another role or end up leaving as a result of being rejected from the main reason they joined in the first place. All of this before newbies are welcomed into the club, metaphorically speaking. There are still, and may always be, cliques going around in heritage organisations. But that's more the attitude of human nature than it is that of the organisation. It just happens sometimes. You go through life doing whatever you can to be all things to all people, and there'll always be those who just won't like you or just won't get along with you, just because. They say that if you can't handle people taking the piss out of you, then you shouldn't be on the railways, and to an extent I can kind of see what those people mean, as the nature of the work can be very tough. That doesn't mean I agree with it, it's just life. But then of course, it can be made difficult for those who misinterpret friendly banter as deliberately being singled out. And on the flip side of that coin, it's unacceptable to pass off singling someone out for their differences as friendly banter. Especially now spectrums like autism, BPD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, ADD and so on are becoming more widely recognised and accepted in society, even though some employers continue to lie about their discriminative attitudes. It's bad enough there's still sexism in railway preservation, but it's nice to see the Heritage Railway Association allowing Joanne Crompton to speak up about that issue. You can read about her notes in a link in the description. Another problem seems to be the wider challenges that young people face trying to get by and get ahead in day-to-day life without giving their time away for free. We joke about the price of Freddos going up, but I think we use that just to distract ourselves from the more depressing spikes. According to Status Quo guitarist and frontman Francis Rossi, in 1975 you could buy a substantial 11-bedroom house on a private estate in Purley, South London, with a private drive, heated swimming pool and large garden for £80,000, worth around $686,000 today. But these days, house values have gone up so much that $686,000 would barely get you a 3-bedroom detached place in the same area. As of writing this editorial, Rossi's former £80,000 home, which he actually bought for £50,000 cash mortgage-free, was valued at just under £5.1 million. Hell, $80,000 by today's standards doesn't even get you a 2-storey tumble-down street house in Sheffield with cracks in the walls and damp floorboards. $50,000 does get you a house, but only if you're prepared to move to some of the least desirable areas in the country that would likely get you robbed and stabbed in a matter of weeks. And you might imagine that with the cost of housing and general living going up all the time, wages will be going up to help you get ahead of them, right?
Very funny.
As a result, most people in their 20s and 30s are now forced to rent in order to have somewhere to live that isn't their parents' place. And any other waking moment, those who are unable to get that decent, well-paid job they were told they would just stroll into without fail if they just did well enough in school, further education and higher education, only to be told they were overqualified for that work and that they'd just been lied to all along for the sake of making their skill look good, now end up working more hours in low-paid work, which means they have even less free time to spare, which makes any free time at all more valuable to them. So the idea that an usher at a cinema who has to work more than 40 hours a week on minimum wage, cleaning toilets, getting shouted at by the public because their prices are too high, and getting reprimanded by their management because they were unable to sell anything due to their prices being too high, would then want to give up whatever free time they're able to spare for recharging their energies to put in long days cleaning out locomotive pits, sweeping platforms, and more or less doing the same sort of thing they do for a living but without getting paid for it and somehow not burn out in the long run, is a bit of a hard sell for new recruits. Especially when, legally speaking, you're not allowed to work for more than 12 hours at a time, even though some companies have still managed to get away with it from experience. The problem of free labour is already being combated to an extent by offering minimum or even living wage roles at certain heritage railways during the summer months. Over the last few years, the Swanage Railway have offered payment for seasonal roles such as train cleaners, and the Festiniog and Welsh Highland lines have provided a certain number of paid roles for front-of-house jobs in the summer months. But with some railways being unable to pay for their own day-to-day maintenance, that business model may not be universally sustainable in the short term, let alone the long run. Furthermore, it's common to find the same volunteers working on more than one railway in quick succession. Sometimes that may be because people can't stay away from the hobby for very long. Sometimes that's because people like to work at multiple railways on different gauges in different places with different groups of people. But sometimes there aren't necessarily enough volunteers to go round, and the same people have to do the same jobs at the same railways day in, day out. This has led to the suggestion by some people that there are perhaps too many heritage railways out there. And back in 1993, the then chairman of the Severn Valley Railway had this to say about the long-term sustainability of railway preservation.
No, what I can see is a total parallel between the South Sea bubble of the 1860s and 1870s, when masses of private railways were formed, with prospectuses, I might add. And how long did they last? For goodness sake, many of them didn't even get off the ground, did they? Even before the prospectus had seen the light and print, they were in actual fact amalgamating. So there are remarkable parallels between the profusion of private railways today and the profusion of private railways in the Victorian era of 1850, 60 and 70. And my belief, which is quite strongly held, is that we will see a similar end result. There will be an amalgamation of railways. The strong will win, the weak will fall by the wayside. It may be done with sleight of hand, may be done very, very nicely, but there is no way that 35 private enterprise railways, standard and narrow gauge, can exist in a relatively small country competing for a finite customer list.
Now, it's kind of hard to show clips of Michael Draper without acknowledging that, yes, things did happen between him and the Severn Valley Railway shortly afterwards, but it just goes to show that this sort of view hasn't necessarily come out of the 21st century. Sadly, whether it's a lack of interest, role preference, discrimination, politics, health and safety, personal burnout, or anything else that becomes off-putting, preservation societies end up becoming the victims in the long run. 10 years ago, one of the bigger heritage railways didn't have room for trainees on their locoman's roster, but now some of those who used to fill their rosters have gone, there's fewer fully trained people filling their shoes. And with less experience than the last of the XBR generation, they in turn may not always pack sufficient confidence, experience and enthusiasm to train new people up. So, what can be done to bring more people into the hobby? The answer simply isn't universally cut and dry, and for every pro, there's a con. Some people say running junior groups for preteens to gain their interest at the right age is one answer, even though it comes with background checks, safety concerns, and getting people in with the right attitude to run these groups. Some people say there needs to be less paperwork and safety regimes so people don't get put off with the bureaucratic side of membership. But then again, it's not always the heritage railways who enforce such paperwork, but the higher authorities who hold the power to shut anybody down if they don't follow the rules. Some people say more one-to-one assessment, tuition, and working with experienced members is necessary to help new people get into the swing of things, but that mostly depends on enough people with the right attitudes and experience being available to begin with. Some people say simply keeping an open, non-discriminant mind on learning inconveniences, different personality traits, and even different genders is the answer. But with some people just being the way they are, there's always going to be those who will remain closed-minded. Hell, some people say that simply inviting someone up on the footplate to have a look is enough to make them think, wow, I'd like to do that one day. And yes, it really does turn out to be a gesture that becomes the highlight of someone's visit, which they'll remember for the rest of their life. But not everybody is willing to let passengers come up and have a look. I know this is a problem with attracting people of all ages and abilities into the hobby, and not just the fit young blood, but it's likely easier to convince people who've retired, paid off their mortgage, and don't have much else to do with their time to become volunteers than those who barely have any time left after burning themselves out just to get by. A heritage railway can offer more than just a train ride, but with universal challenges forever changing, individual adaptation is kind of the key to keeping everyone's heritage alive. But this is all just one perspective. What do you think heritage railways need to do to attract new volunteers? What resolutions do you know of that are already in place? Are there improvements to be made? Things that need stamping out or are being stamped out? Can we make railway heritage more sustainable? Or do you simply have time on your hands? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Or in the pub, now that we can finally do that again. Got the usual on tap. I'm Chris, and I'm here to gauge the issue.
I lost my mind in lockdown, time and time again. I lost my mind in lockdown.